The mole had been working very hard all the morning, spring cleaning his little home, first with brooms, then with dusters, then on ladders and steps and chairs with a brush and a pail of whitewash, till he had dust in his throat and eyes and splashes of whitewash all over his black fur and an aching back and weary arms. Spring was moving in the air above and in the earth below and around him, penetrating even his dark and lowly little house with its spirit of divine discontent and longing. It was small wonder then that he suddenly flung down his brush on the floor and said, "Bother!" and "Oh, blow!" and also, "Hang spring cleaning!" and bolted out of the house without even waiting to put on his coat, muttering to himself, "Up we go, till at last, pop, his snout came out into the sunlight, and he found himself rolling in the warm grass of a great meadow. "This is fine," he said to himself. "This is better than whitewashing." The sunshine struck hot on his fur, soft breezes caressed his heated brow, and after the seclusion of the cellarage he had lived in so long, the carol of happy birds fell on his dulled hearing almost like a shout. Jumping off all his 4 legs at once, in the joy of living and the delight of spring without its cleaning, he pursued his way across the meadow. It all seemed too good to be true. Hither and thither he rambled busily along the hedgerows, across the copses, and instead of having an uneasy conscience pricking him and whispering, "Whitewash," he somehow could only feel how jolly it was to be the only idle dog among all these busy citizens. He thought his happiness was complete when, as he meandered aimlessly along, suddenly he stood by the edge of a full-fed river. Never in his life had he seen a river before. This sleek, sinuous, full-bodied animal, chasing and chuckling, gripping things with a gurgle and leaving them with a laugh to fling himself on fresh playmates that shook themselves free and were caught and held again. All was a shake and a shiver, glints and gleams and sparkles, rustle and whirl, chatter and bubble. As he sat on the grass and looked across the river, a dark hole in the bank opposite, just above the water's edge, caught his eye. As he gazed, something bright and small seemed to twinkle down in the heart of it, vanished, then twinkled once more like a tiny star. But it could hardly be a star in such an unlikely situation, and it was too glittering and small for a glow-worm. Then, as he looked, it winked at him, and so declared itself to be an eye, and a small face began gradually to grow up round it, like a frame round a picture. A brown face with whiskers. A grave, round face with the same twinkle in its eye that had first attracted his notice. Small, neat ears and thick, silky hair. It was the water rat. Then the 2 animals stood and regarded each other cautiously. "Hello, Mole," said the water rat. "Hello, Rat," said the Mole. "Would you like to come over?" inquired the Rat presently. "Oh, it's all very well to talk," said the Mole rather pettishly, being new to a river and riverside life and its ways. The Rat said nothing, but stooped and unfastened a rope and hauled on it, then lightly stepped into a little boat, which the Mole had not observed. It was painted blue outside and white within, and was just the size for 2 animals, and the Mole's whole heart went out to it at once, even though he did not yet fully understand its uses. The Rat sculled smartly across and made fast. Then he held up his forepaw as the Mole stepped gingerly down. "Lean on that," he said. "Now then, step lively." And the Mole, to his surprise and rapture, found himself actually seated in the stern of a real boat. "This has been a wonderful day," said he, as the Rat shoved off and took to the sculls again. "Do you know, I have never been in a boat before in all my life." "What?" cried the Rat, open-mouthed. "Never been in a... You never... Well, What have you been doing, then?"
"Is it so nice as all that?" asked the Mole shyly.
"Nice? It's the only thing," said the Water Rat solemnly as he leaned forward for his stroke.
Believe me, my young friend, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, half so much worth doing as simply messing about in boats. Simply messing, he went on dreamily, messing about in boats. Messing...
"Look ahead, Rat!" cried the Mole suddenly. It was too late. The boat struck the bank full tilt. The dreamer, the joyous oarsman, lay on his back at the bottom of the boat, his heels in the air.
About in boats, or with boats,
The Rat went on composedly, picking himself up with a pleasant laugh.
Look here, if you've really nothing else on hand this morning, supposing we drop down the river together and have a long day of it.
The Mole waggled his toes from sheer happiness, spread his chest with a sigh of full contentment, and leaned back blissfully into the soft cushions. "What a day I'm having," he said. "Let us start at once."
Hold hard a minute, then,
said the Rat. He looped the painter through a ring in his landing stage, climbed up into his hole above, and after a short interval reappeared, staggering under a fat wicker luncheon basket.
Shove that under your feet,
he observed to the Mole as he passed it down into the boat. Then he untied the painter and took the sculls again. "What's inside it?" asked the Mole, wriggling with curiosity.
There's cold chicken inside it, replied the Rat briefly. Cold tongue, cold ham, cold beef, pickled gherkins, salad French rolls, crisp sandwiches, potted meat, ginger beer, lemonade, soda water.
"Oh, stop, stop!" cried the Mole in ecstasies. "This is too much."
Do you really think so? Inquired the Rat seriously. It's only what I always take on these little excursions, and the other animals are always telling me that I'm a mean beast and cut it very fine.
The Mole never heard a word he was saying. Absorbed in the new life he was entering upon, intoxicated with the sparkle, the ripple, the scents, the sounds of the sunlight, he trailed a paw in the water and dreamed long, waking dreams. "So this is a river," he remarked at length.
The river, corrected the Rat.
"And you really live by the river? What a jolly life!"
By it, with it, and on it, and in it, said the Rat. It's brother and sister to me, and aunts, and company, and food and drink, and, naturally, washing. It's my world, and I don't want any other.
"What lies over there?" asked the Mole, waving a paw towards a background of woodland that darkly framed the water meadows on one side of the river.
That? Oh, that's just the wild wood, said the Rat shortly. We don't go there very much, we river bankers.
Aren't they very nice people in there?" said the Mole, a trifle nervously.
Well, let me see. The squirrels are all right, and the rabbits. Some of them. The rabbits are a mixed lot. And then there's Badger, of course. He lives right in the heart of it. Wouldn't live anywhere else either. Dear old Badger, and nobody interferes with him. They'd better not, he added significantly.
"Why, who should interfere with him?" asked the Mole.
Well, of course, there are others, explained the Rat in a hesitating sort of way. Weasels and stoats and foxes and so on, they're all right in a way. I'm very good friends with them, pass the time of day when we meet and all that. But they break out sometimes, there's no denying it, and then, well, you can't really trust them, and that's the fact.
The Rat brought the boat alongside the bank, made her fast, helped the still awkward Mole safely ashore, and swung out the luncheon basket. When all was ready, the Rat said,
Now, pitch in, old fellow.
And the Mole was indeed very glad to obey.
What are you looking at?
Said the Rat presently, when the edge of their hunger was somewhat dulled, and the Mole's eyes were able to wander off the tablecloth a little. "I am looking," said the Mole, "at a streak of bubbles that I see travelling along the surface of the water. That is a thing that strikes me as funny."
Bubbles? Ho, ho, said the Rat, and chirruped cheerily in an inviting sort of way. A broad, glistening muzzle showed itself above the edge of the bank, and the otter
hauled himself out and shook the water from his coat.
Greedy beggars,
he observed, making for the provender.
why didn't you invite me, Ratty?
This was an impromptu affair, explained the rat. By the way, my friend, Mr. Mole.
Proud, I'm sure.
Said the otter, and the two animals were friends forthwith.
Such a rumpus everywhere, continued the otter. All the world seems out on the river today. I came up this backwater to try and get a moment's peace, and then stumble upon you fellows. At least, I beg your pardon, I don't exactly mean that, you know.
Well, tell us, urged the rat. Who's out on the river?
Toad's out, for one, replied the otter. It is brand new wager boat. New togs, new everything.
The two animals looked at each other and laughed.
Once it was nothing but sailing. Then he tired of that and took to punting. It's all the same. Whatever he takes up, he gets tired of it and starts on something fresh.
Such a good fellow, too, remarked the otter reflectively. But no stability, especially in a boat.
From where they sat, they could get a glimpse of the main stream across the island that separated them. And just then, a wager boat flashed into view. The rower, a short, stout figure, splashing badly and rolling a good deal, but working his hardest. The rat stood up and hailed him, but Toad, for it was he, shook his head and settled sternly to his work.
He'll be out of the boat in a minute if he rolls like that,
said the rat, sitting down again.
Of course he will, chuckled the otter. Did I ever tell you that good story about Toad and the lock-keeper? It happened this way. Toad...
An errant mayfly swerved unsteadily athwart the current in the intoxicated fashion affected by young bloods of mayflies seeing life. A swirl of water and a cloop, and the mayfly was visible no more. Neither was the otter. But again there was a streak of bubbles on the surface of the river.
Well, well, said the rat. I suppose we ought to be moving. I wonder which of us had better pack the luncheon basket.
He did not speak as if he was frightfully eager for the treat.
Oh, please, let me,
said the mole. So, of course, the rat let him. When they got home, the rat made a bright fire in the parlour and planted the mole in an armchair in front of it, having fetched down a dressing-gown and slippers for him, and told him river stories till supper-time. Supper was a most cheerful meal, but very shortly afterwards a terribly sleepy mole had to be escorted upstairs by his considerate host to the best bedroom, where he soon laid his head on his pillow in great peace and contentment, knowing that his new-found friend the river was lapping the sill of his window. This day was only the first of many similar ones for the emancipated mole, each of them longer and fuller of interest as the ripening summer moved onward. He learnt to swim and to row, and entered into the joy of running water, and with his ear to the reed stems he caught at intervals something of what the wind went whispering so constantly among them.
Ratty,
said the mole suddenly one bright summer morning,
if you please, I want to ask you a favour. What I wanted to ask you was, won't you take me to call on Mr. Toad? I've heard so much about him, and I do so want to make his acquaintance.
Why, certainly,
said the good-natured rat, jumping to his feet.
Get the boat out, and we'll paddle up there at once. It's never the wrong time to call on Toad. Early or late, he's always the same fellow, always good-tempered, always glad to see you, always sorry when you go.
He must be a very nice animal,
observed the mole, as he got into the boat and took the sculls, while the rat settled himself comfortably in the stern.
He is indeed the best of animals,
replied Rat.
So simple, so good-natured, and so affectionate. Perhaps he's not very clever. We can't all be geniuses, and it may be that he is both boastful and conceited. But he has got some great qualities, has Toady.
Rounding a bend in the river, they came in sight of a handsome, dignified old house of mellowed red brick, with well-kept lawns reaching down to the water's edge.
There's Toad Hall, said the rat. Toad is rather rich, you know, and this is really one of the nicest houses in these parts, though we never admit as much to Toad.
They glided up the creek, and the mole shipped his sculls as they passed into the shadow of a large boathouse. Here they saw many handsome boats slung from the crossbeams or hauled up on a slip, but none in the water, and the place had an unused and a deserted air. The rat looked round him.
I understand,
Said he.
boating is played out. He's tired of it and done with it. I wonder what new fad he's taken up now. Come along and let's look him up. We shall hear all about it quite soon enough.
They disembarked and strolled across the gay, flower-decked lawns in search of Toad, whom they presently happened upon resting in a wicker garden chair, with a preoccupied expression of face and a large map spread out on his knees.
Hooray!
He cried, jumping up on seeing them.
This is splendid.
He shook the paws of both of them warmly, never waiting for an introduction to the mole.
How kind of you,
He went on, dancing round them.
I was just going to send a boat down the river for you, Ratty, with strict orders that you were to be fetched up here at once, whatever you were doing. You are the very animals I wanted. You've got to help me. It's most important.
It's about your rowing, I suppose,
Said the rat with an innocent air.
You're getting on fairly well, though you splash a good bit still. With a great deal of patience and any quantity of coaching, you may...
Oh, pooh, boating, interrupted the Toad in great disgust. Silly boyish amusement. I've given that up long ago. Sure waste of time, that's what it is.
He led the way to the stable yard, the rat following with a most mistrustful expression, and there, drawn out of the coach-house into the open, they saw a gypsy caravan, shining with newness, painted a canary yellow, picked out with green and red wheels.
There you are,
Cried the Toad, prattling and expanding himself.
there's real life for you, embodied in that little cart. The open road, the dusty highway, the heath, the common, the hedgerows, the rolling downs, the whole world before you, and a horizon that's always changing. And mind, this is the very finest cart of its sort that was ever built, without any exception. Come inside and look at the arrangements.
It was indeed very compact and comfortable,
All complete.
said the Toad triumphantly, pulling open a locker.
You see, biscuits, potted lobster, sardines, everything you can possibly want. You'll find that nothing whatever has been forgotten when we make our start this afternoon.
I beg your pardon,
Said the rat slowly as he chewed a straw.
but did I overhear you say something about we and start and this afternoon?
Now, you dear good old Ratty, don't begin talking in that stiff and sniffy sort of way, because you know you've got to come. I can't possibly manage without you, so please consider it settled and don't argue. It's the one thing I can't stand. You surely don't mean to stick to your dull, fusty old river all your life and just live in a hole in a bank and boat? I want to show you the world. I'm going to make an animal of you, my boy.
I don't care.
Said the rat doggedly.
I'm not coming, and that's flat. And I am going to stick to my old river and live in a hole and boat as I've always done. And what's more, Mole's going to stick to me and do as I do, aren't you, Mole?
Oh, of course I am, said the mole loyally. I'll always stick to you, Rat, and what you say is to be, has got to be. All the same, it sounds as if it might have been, well, rather fun, you know. The rat saw what was passing in his mind and wavered. He hated disappointing people, and he was fond of the mole, and would do almost anything to oblige him. Toad was watching both of them closely.
Come along in and have some lunch, he said diplomatically, "and we'll talk it over. We needn't decide anything in a hurry. Of course, I don't really care. I only want to give pleasure to you fellows. Live for others. That's my motto."
During luncheon, which was excellent, of course, as everything at Toad Hall always was, the Toad simply let himself go. Disregarding the rat, he proceeded to play upon the inexperienced Mole as on a harp. Somehow it soon seemed taken for granted by all three of them that the trip was a settled thing, and the rat, though still unconvinced in his mind, allowed his good nature to override his personal objections. He could not bear to disappoint his two friends, who were already deep in schemes and anticipations, planning out each day's separate occupation for several weeks ahead. When they were quite ready, the now triumphant Toad led his companions to the paddock and set them to capture the old grey horse. It was a golden afternoon. The smell of the dust they kicked up was rich and satisfying. Out of thick orchards on either side of the road, birds called and whistled to them cheerily. Good-natured wayfarers passing them gave them "good day," or stopped to say nice things about their beautiful cart, and rabbits, sitting at their front doors in the hedgerows, held up their forepaws and said, "Oh my, oh my, oh my." Late in the evening, tired and happy and miles from home, they drew up on a remote common far from habitations, turned the horse loose to graze, and ate their simple supper sitting on the grass by the side of the cart. After so much open air and excitement, the Toad slept very soundly, and no amount of shaking could rouse him out of bed next morning. So the Mole and Rat turned to, quietly and manfully, and while the Rat saw to the horse and lit a fire and cleaned last night's cups and platters and got things ready for breakfast, the Mole trudged off to the nearest village, a long way off, for milk and eggs and various necessaries the Toad had, of course, forgotten to provide. They had a pleasant ramble that day over grassy downs and along narrow by-lanes, and camped, as before, on a common. Only this time the two guests took care that Toad should do his fair share of work. In consequence, when the time came for starting next morning, Toad was by no means so rapturous about the simplicity of the primitive life, and indeed attempted to resume his place in his bunk, whence he was hauled by force. They were strolling along the high road easily, the Mole by the horse's head, talking to him, since the horse had complained that he was being frightfully left out of it, when far behind them they heard a faint warning hum, like the drone of a distant bee. Glancing back, they saw a small cloud of dust with a dark centre of energy advancing on them at incredible speed, while from out of the dust a faint poop-poop wailed like an uneasy animal in pain. Hardly regarding it, they turned to resume their conversation, when in an instant, as it seemed, the peaceful scene was changed, and with a blast of wind and a whirl of sound that made them jump for the nearest ditch, it was on them. The poop-poop rang with a brazen shout in their ears. They had a moment's glimpse of an interior of glittering plate glass and rich morocco, and the magnificent motor car, immense, breath-snatching, passionate, with its pilot tense and hugging at its wheel, possessed all earth and air for the fraction of a second, flung an enveloping cloud of dust that blinded and enwrapped them utterly, and then dwindled as a speck in the far distance, changed back into a droning bee once more. The old grey horse, dreaming as he plodded along of his quiet paddock, in a new raw situation such as this, simply abandoned himself to his natural emotions, rearing, plunging, backing steadily in spite of all the Mole's efforts at his head and all the Mole's lively language directed at his better feelings. He drove the cart backwards towards the deep ditch at the side of the road. It wavered an instant, then there was a heart-rending crash, and the canary-coloured cart, their pride and their joy, lay on its side in the ditch. An irredeemable wreck. The Rat danced up and down in the road, simply transported with passion.
"You villains!"
he shouted, shaking both fists.
"You scoundrels! You highwaymen! You road hogs! I'll have the law on you! I'll report you! I'll take you through all the courts!"
Toad sat straight down in the middle of the dusty road, his legs stretched out before him, and stared fixedly in the direction of the disappearing motor car. He breathed short. His face wore a placid, satisfied expression, and at intervals he faintly murmured, "Poop, poop." The mole was busy trying to quiet the horse, which he succeeded in doing after a time. Then he went to look at the cart on its side in the ditch. The rat came to help him, but their united efforts were not sufficient to right the cart.
"Hey, Toad," he cried. "Come bear a hand, can't you?"
The rat returned and shook him by the shoulder.
"Are you coming to help us, Toad?"
Glorious, stirring sight.
Murmured Toad, never offering to move.
The poetry of motion, the real way to travel, the only way to travel. Here today, and in next week, tomorrow. Villages skipped, towns and cities jumped. Always somebody else's horizon. Oh, bliss, oh, poop, poop, oh, my, oh, my.
"Stop being an ass, Toad," cried the mole despairingly.
And to think I never knew,
Went on the toad in a dreamy monotone.
all those wasted years that lie behind me, I never knew and never even dreamt. But now that I know, now that I fully realize, oh, what a flowery track lies before me. Henceforth, what dust clouds shall spread up behind me as I speed on my reckless way? What carts I shall fling carelessly into the ditch in the wake of my magnificent onset? Horrid little carts, common little carts, canary-coloured carts.
"What are we to do with him?" asked the mole of the water rat.
"Nothing at all,"
replied the rat firmly.
"Because there is really nothing to be done. You see, I know him from of old. He is now possessed. He has got a new craze. Never mind him. Let's go and see what there is to be done about the cart."
A careful inspection showed them that, even if they succeeded in righting it by themselves, the cart would travel no longer. The axles were in a hopeless state, and the missing wheel was shattered into pieces. The rat knotted the horse's reins over his back and took him by the head.
"Come on,"
he said grimly to the mole.
"It's 5 or 6 miles to the nearest town, and we shall just have to walk it."
"But what about Toad?" asked the mole anxiously as they set off together. "We can't leave him here, sitting in the middle of the road by himself in the distracted state he's in. It's not safe. Supposing another thing were to come along."
"Oh, bother, Toad,"
said the rat savagely.
"I've done with him."
They had not proceeded very far on their way, however, when there was a pattering of feet behind them, and Toad caught them up and thrust a paw inside the elbow of each of them, still breathing short and staring into vacancy.
"Now look here, Toad,"
said the rat sharply.
"as soon as we get to the town, you'll have to go straight to the police station and see if they know anything about that motor car and who it belongs to, and lodge a complaint against it. And then you'll have to go to a blacksmith's or a wheelwright's and arrange for the cart to be fetched and mended and put to rights."
Police station complaint.
Murmured Toad dreamily.
Me complain of that beautiful, that heavenly vision that has been vouchsafed me. Mend the cart. I've done with carts forever.
The rat turned from him in despair.
"You see what it is,"
He said to the mole, addressing him across Toad's head.
"It's quite hopeless. I give it up."
On reaching the town, they went straight to the station and deposited Toad in the second-class waiting room, giving the porter 2pence to keep a strict eye on him. Then they left the horse at an inn stable and gave what directions they could about the cart and its contents. Eventually, a slow train having landed them at a station not very far from Toad Hall, they escorted the spellbound and sleepwalking Toad to his door, put him inside it, and instructed his housekeeper to feed him, undress him, and put him to bed. Then they got out their boat from the boathouse, sculled down the river home, and at a very late hour sat down to supper in their own cosy riverside parlour, to the rat's great joy and contentment. The following evening, the mole, who had risen late and taken things very easy all day, was sitting on the bank fishing when the rat came strolling along to find him.
"Heard the news?"
he said.
"There's nothing else being talked about all along the river bank. Toad went up to town by an early train this morning, and he has ordered a large and very expensive motor car."
The mole had long wanted to make the acquaintance of the badger. He seemed by all accounts to be such an important personage, and though rarely visible, to make his unseen influence felt by everybody about the place. But whenever the mole mentioned his wish to the water rat, he always found himself put off.
"It's all right," the rat would say. "Badger'll turn up some day or other. He's always turning up, and then I'll introduce you. The best of fellows. But you must not only take him as you find him, but when you find him."
The mole had to be content with this. But the badger never came along. Summer was long over, and cold and frost and miry ways kept them much indoors, but there was plenty to talk about on these short winter days when the animals found themselves round the fire. Still, the mole had a good deal of spare time on his hands, so one afternoon, when the rat, in his armchair before the blaze, was alternately dozing and trying over rhymes that wouldn't fit, he formed the resolution to go out by himself and explore the wild wood, and perhaps strike up an acquaintance with Mr. Badger. There was nothing to alarm him at first entry. Everything was very still. The dusk advanced on him steadily, rapidly, gathering in behind and before, and the light seemed to be draining away like flood water. Then the faces began. It was over his shoulder and indistinctly that he first thought he saw a face, a little evil, wedge-shaped face, looking out at him from a hole. When he turned and confronted it, the thing had vanished. He swung off the path and plunged into the untrodden places of the wood. Then the whistling began. Very faint and shrill it was, and far behind him when first he heard it, but somehow it made him hurry forward. Then, still very faint and shrill, it sounded far ahead of him, and made him hesitate and want to go back. They were up and alert and ready, evidently, whoever they were, and he was alone and unarmed and far from any help, and the night was closing in. Then the pattering began. He thought it was only falling leaves at first, so slight and delicate was the sound of it. Then, as it grew, it took a regular rhythm, and he knew it for nothing else but the pat, pat, pat of little feet, still a very long way off. The pattering increased till it sounded like a sudden hail on the dry leaf carpet spread round him. The whole wood seemed running now, running hard, hunting, chasing, closing in round something or somebody. At last he took refuge in the dark, deep hollow of an old beech tree, and as he lay there, panting and trembling, and listening to the whistlings and the patterings outside, he knew it at last, that thing which the rat had vainly tried to shield him from, the terror of the wild wood. Meantime, the rat, warm and comfortable, dozed by his fireside. Then a coal slipped, the fire crackled and sent up a spurt of flame, and he woke with a start. He called, "Mole!" several times, and receiving no answer, got up and went out into the hall. The mole's cap was missing from its accustomed peg. His galoshes, which always lay by the umbrella stand, were also gone. The rat left the house and carefully examined the muddy surface of the ground outside, hoping to find the mole's tracks. There they were, sure enough. The galoshes were new, just bought for the winter, and the pimples on their soles were fresh and sharp. He could see the imprints of them in the mud, running along straight and purposeful, leading direct to the wild wood. The rat looked very grave and stood in deep thought for a minute or two. Then he re-entered the house, strapped a belt round his waist, shoved a brace of pistols into it, took up a stout cudgel that stood in the corner of the hall, and set off for the wild wood at a smart pace. He had patiently hunted through the wood for an hour or more, calling as he went, when at last, to his joy, he heard a little answering cry. Guiding himself by the sound, he made his way through the gathering darkness to the foot of an old beech tree with a hole in it, and from out of the hole came a feeble voice saying, "Ratty, is that really you?" The rat crept into the hollow, and there he found the mole, exhausted and still trembling. "Oh, Rat," he cried. "I've been so frightened you can't think."
"Oh, I quite understand,"
said the rat soothingly.
"You shouldn't really have gone and done it, Mole. I did my best to keep you from it. We riverbankers, we hardly ever come here by ourselves. Now then, we really must pull ourselves together and make a start for home while there's still a little light left."
"Dear Ratty, I'm dreadfully sorry, but I'm simply dead beat, and that's a solid fact. You must let me rest here a little while longer and get my strength back if I'm to get home at all."
"Oh, all right,"
said the good-natured rat.
"Rest away. It's pretty nearly pitch dark now anyhow, and there ought to be a bit of a moon later."
So the mole got well into the dry leaves and stretched himself out and presently dropped off into sleep. When at last the mole woke up, much refreshed and in his usual spirits, the rat said,
"Now then, I'll just take a look outside and see if everything's quiet, and then we really must be off."
He went to the entrance of their retreat and put his head out. Then the mole heard him saying quietly to himself,
"Hello, hello, here is a go."
"What's up, Ratty?" asked the mole.
"Snow is up. Or rather, down. It's snowing hard."
The mole came and crouched beside him, and looking out saw the wood that had been so dreadful to him in quite a changed aspect. Holes, hollows, pools, pitfalls, and other black menaces to the wayfarer were vanishing fast. The gleaming carpet looked too delicate to be trodden upon by rough feet.
"We must make a start,"
said the rat.
"The worst of it is, I don't know exactly where we are."
However, they set out bravely, and took the line that seemed most promising. An hour or two later, they had lost all count of time, they pulled up, dispirited, weary, and helplessly at sea, and sat down on a fallen tree trunk to recover their breath and consider what was to be done.
"We can't sit here very long. The snow will soon be too deep for us to wade through."
He peered about him and considered.
"Look here," he went on. "This is what occurs to me. There's a sort of dell down there in front of us where the ground seems all hilly and humpy and hummocky. We'll make our way down into there and try to find some sort of shelter, a cave or hole with a dry floor to it, out of the snow and the wind, and there we'll have a good rest before we try again, for both of us are pretty dead beat."
So once more they got on their feet and struggled down into the dell, where they hunted about for a cave or some corner that was dry and a protection from the keen wind and the whirling snow. They were investigating one of the hummocky bits the rat had spoken of when suddenly the mole tripped up and fell forward on his face with a squeal. "Oh, my leg!" he cried. "Oh, my poor shin!" And he sat up on the snow and nursed his leg in both his front paws.
"Poor old mole,"
said the rat kindly.
"You don't seem to be having much luck today, do you? Let's have a look at the leg. Yes," he went on, going down on his knees to look. "You've cut your shin, sure enough. Wait till I get my handkerchief, and I'll tie it up for you."
"I must have tripped over a hidden branch or a stump." "Oh, my, oh, my."
"It's a very clean cut,"
said the rat, examining it again attentively.
"That was never done by a branch or a stump. Looks as if it were made by a sharp edge of something in metal. Funny."
He pondered a while and examined the humps and slopes that surrounded them. "Well, never mind what done it," said the mole, forgetting his grammar in his pain. "It hurts just the same, whatever done it." But the rat, after carefully tying up the leg with his handkerchief, had left him and was busy scraping in the snow. He scratched and shovelled and explored, all four legs working busily, while the mole waited impatiently, remarking at intervals, "Oh, come on, rat." Suddenly the rat cried,
"Hooray!"
and then,
"Hooray, hooray, hooray, hooray!"
and fell to executing a feeble jig in the snow. "What have you found, Ratty?" asked the mole, still nursing his leg.
"Come and see,"
said the delighted rat as he jigged on. The mole hobbled up to the spot and had a good look. "Well, I see it right enough,"
Seen the same sort of thing before, lots of times. Familiar object, I call it. A door scraper. Well, what of it? Why dance jigs around a door scraper?
Don't you see what it means, you dull-witted animal?
Cried the rat impatiently. Of course I see what it means. It simply means that some very careless and forgetful person has left his door scraper lying about in the middle of the wildwood.
Oh, dear,
cried the rat in despair at his obtuseness.
Here, stop arguing and come and scrape.
And he set to work again and made the snow fly in all directions around him. After some further toil, his efforts were rewarded, and a very shabby doormat lay exposed to view.
There! What did I tell you?
Exclaimed the rat in great triumph. Absolutely nothing whatever, replied the mole with perfect truthfulness. Well, now, you seem to have found another piece of domestic litter done for and thrown away.
Do you mean to say that this doormat doesn't tell you anything?
Really, rat, said the mole quite pettishly. I think we've had enough of this folly. Who ever heard of a doormat telling anyone anything? They simply don't do it. They're not that sort at all. Doormats know their place.
Now look here, you thick-headed beast,
replied the rat, really angry.
This must stop. Not another word, but scrape, and scratch and dig and hunt around, especially on the sides of the hummocks if you want to sleep dry and warm tonight, for it's our last chance.
The rat attacked a snowbank beside them with ardour, probing with his cudgel everywhere and then digging with fury, and the mole scraped busily too, more to oblige Rat than for any other reason, for his opinion was that his friend was getting light-headed. Some 10 minutes' hard work, and the point of the rat's cudgel struck something that sounded hollow. In the side of what had seemed to be a snowbank stood a solid-looking little door, painted a dark green. An iron bell-pull hung by the side, and below it, on a small brass plate neatly engraved in square capital letters, they could read by the aid of the moonlight, Mr. Badger. The mole fell backwards on the snow from sheer surprise and delight. Rat! He cried in penitence. You are a wonder, a real wonder, that's what you are. You're simply wasted here among us fellows. If only I had your head, Ratty.
But, as you haven't,
interrupted the rat rather unkindly,
I suppose you're going to sit on the snow all night and talk. Get up at once and hang on to that bell-pull you see there, and ring hard as you can, while I hammer.
While the rat attacked the door with his stick, the mole sprang up at the bell-pull, clutched it and swung there, both feet well off the ground, and from quite a long way off they could faintly hear a deep-toned bell respond. They waited patiently for what seemed a very long time, stamping in the snow to keep their feet warm. At last they heard the sound of slow, shuffling footsteps approaching the door from the inside. There was the noise of a bolt shot back, and the door opened a few inches, enough to show a long snout and a pair of sleepy, blinking eyes.
Now, the very next time this happens,
said a gruff and suspicious voice,
I shall be exceedingly angry. Who is it this time, disturbing people on such a night? Speak up!
Oh, Badger, let us in, please. It's me, Rat, and my friend Mole, and we've lost our way in the snow.
What, Ratty? My dear little man,
exclaimed the Badger in quite a different voice.
Come along in, both of you at once. Why, you must be perished. Well, I never. Lost in the snow, and in the wildwood, too, and at this time of night. But come in with you.
The two animals tumbled over each other in their eagerness to get inside, and at once found themselves in all the glow and warmth of a large, fire-lit kitchen. The kindly Badger thrust them down on a settle to toast themselves at the fire, and bade them remove their wet coats and boots. When at last they were thoroughly toasted, the Badger summoned them to the table, where he'd been busy laying a repast. They had felt pretty hungry before, but when they actually saw at last the supper that was spread before them,
Really, it seemed only a question of what they should attack first, where all was so attractive, and whether the other things would obligingly wait for them till they'd time to give them attention. Conversation was impossible for a long time, and then, when it was slowly resumed, it was that regrettable sort of conversation that results from talking with your mouth full. When supper was really finished at last, and each animal felt that his skin was now as tight as was decently safe, and that by this time he didn't care a hang for anybody or anything, they gathered around the glowing embers of the great wood fire and thought how jolly it was to be sitting up so late and so independent and so full. And after they'd chatted for a long time about things in general, the Badger said heartily,
Now then, tell us the news from your part of the world. How's old Toad going on?
From bad to worse,
said the Rat gravely, while the Mole cocked up on a settle and, basking in the firelight, his heels higher than his head, tried to look properly mournful.
Another smash-up only last week, and a bad one. You see, he will insist on driving himself, and he's hopelessly incapable. If he'd only employ a decent, steady, well-trained animal, pay him good wages, and leave everything to him, he'd get on all right. But no, he is convinced he's a heaven-born driver, and nobody could teach him anything, and all the rest follows.
How many has he had?
Inquired the Badger gloomily.
Smashes or machines?
Asked the Rat.
Oh, well, after all, it's the same thing with Toad. This is the 7th. As for the others, you know that coach house of his? Well, it's piled up, literally piled up to the roof, with fragments of motor cars, none of them bigger than your hat. That accounts for the other 6, so far as they can be accounted for.
Very well, then,
said the Badger.
When once the year has really turned and the nights are shorter, and halfway through them one rouses and feels fidgety and wanting to be up and doing by sunrise, if not before, you know.
Both animals nodded gravely. They knew.
Well, then,
went on the Badger,
we, that is, you and me, and our friend the Mole here, will take Toad seriously in hand. We'll stand no nonsense whatever. We'll bring him back to reason by force, if need be. We'll make him be a sensible Toad. We'll... You're asleep, Rat.
No, not me,
said the Rat, waking up with a jerk. He's been asleep 2 or 3 times since supper, said the Mole, laughing.
Well, it's time we were all in bed,
said the Badger, getting up and fetching flat candlesticks.
Come along, you two, and I'll show you your quarters. And take your time tomorrow morning. Breakfast at any hour you please.
In accordance with the kindly Badger's injunctions, the 2 tired animals came down to breakfast very late next morning, and found a bright fire burning in the kitchen, and 2 young hedgehogs sitting on a bench at the table, eating oatmeal porridge out of wooden bowls. The hedgehogs dropped their spoons, rose to their feet, and ducked their heads respectfully as the 2 entered.
There, sit down, said the Rat pleasantly, and go on with your porridge. Where have you youngsters come from? Lost your way in the snow, I suppose.
Yes, sir,
said the elder of the 2 hedgehogs respectfully.
Me and little Billy here, we was trying to find our way to school. Mother would have us go, and of course we lost ourselves, sir, and Billy he got frightened and took and cried, being young and faint-hearted. And at last we happened up against Mr. Badger's back door, and made so bold as to knock, sir, for Mr. Badger he's a kind-hearted gentleman, as everyone knows.
I understand,
said the Rat, cutting himself some rashers from a side of bacon, while the Mole dropped some eggs into a saucepan.
And what's the weather like outside? You needn't sir me quite so much,
he added.
Oh, terrible bad, sir, terrible deep, the snow is. No getting out for the likes of you gentlemen today.
The front doorbell clanged loudly, and the Rat, who was very greasy with buttered toast, sent Billy, the smaller hedgehog, to see who it might be. There was a sound of much stamping in the hall, and presently Billy returned in front of the Otter, who threw himself on the Rat with an embrace and a shout of affectionate greeting.
Get off,
spluttered the Rat with his mouth full.
Thought I should find you here, all right, said the otter cheerfully. They were all in a great state of alarm along the river bank when I arrived this morning. Rat never been home all night, nor Mole either. Something dreadful must have happened, they said, and the snow had covered up all your tracks, of course. But I knew that when people were in any fix, they mostly went to the Badger, or else Badger got to know it somehow, so I came straight off here, through the wildwood and the snow.
Weren't you at all, nervous? Asked the Mole, some of yesterday's terror coming back to him at the mention of the wildwood.
Nervous?
The otter showed a gleaming set of strong white teeth as he laughed.
I'd give 'em nerves if any of 'em tried anything on with me. Here, Mole, fry me some slices of ham like the good little chap you are. I'm frightfully hungry, and I've got any amount to say to Ratty here. Haven't seen him for an age.
So the good-natured Mole, having cut some slices of ham, set the hedgehogs to fry it, and returned to his own breakfast, while the otter and the rat, their heads together, eagerly talked river shop, which is long shop and talk that is endless, running on like the babbling river itself. A plate of fried ham had just been cleared and sent back for more, when the Badger entered, yawning and rubbing his eyes, and greeted them all in his quiet, simple way, with kind inquiries for everyone.
"It must be getting on for luncheon time,"
he remarked to the otter.
"Better stop and have it with us. You must be hungry this cold morning."
The rat, however, was anxious to be off and attend to his river, so the Badger, taking up his lantern, led the way along a damp and airless tunnel that wound and dipped, part vaulted, part hewn through solid rock for a weary distance that seemed to be miles. At last daylight began to show itself confusedly through tangled growth overhanging the mouth of the passage, and the Badger, bidding them a hasty good-bye, pushed them hurriedly through the opening, made everything look as natural as possible again with creepers, brushwood, and dead leaves, and retreated. They found themselves standing on the very edge of the wildwood. The otter, as knowing all the paths, took charge of the party, and they trailed out on a bee-line for a distant stile. As he hurried along, eagerly anticipating the moment when he would be at home again among the things he knew and liked, the Mole saw clearly that he was an animal of tilled field and hedgerow, the frequented pasture, the lane of evening lingerings, the cultivated garden plot. For others, the asperities that went with nature in the rough, he must be wise, must keep to the pleasant places in which his lines were laid, and which held adventure enough in their way to last for a lifetime. It was a bright morning in the early part of summer. The river had resumed its wonted banks and its accustomed pace, and a hot sun seemed to be pulling everything green and bushy and spiky up out of the earth towards him as if by strings. The Mole and the Water Rat were finishing breakfast in their little parlour and eagerly discussing their plans for the day when a heavy knock sounded at the door.
"Oh, bother,"
said the Rat, all over egg.
"See who it is, Mole, like a good chap, since you've finished."
The Mole went to attend the summons, and the Rat heard him utter a cry of surprise. Then he flung the parlour door open and announced with much importance, "Mr. Badger." This was a wonderful thing indeed, that the Badger should pay a formal call on them, or indeed on anybody. He had generally to be caught, if you wanted him badly, as he slipped quietly along a hedgerow of an early morning or a late evening, or else hunted up in his own house in the middle of the wood, which was a serious undertaking. The Badger strode heavily into the room and stood looking at the two animals with an expression full of seriousness. The Rat let his egg-spoon fall on the tablecloth and sat open-mouthed.
"The hour has come,"
said the Badger at last, with great solemnity.
"What hour?"
asked the Rat uneasily, glancing at the clock on the mantelpiece.
"Whose hour, you should rather say,"
replied the Badger.
"Why, Toad's hour, the hour of Toad. I said I would take him in hand as soon as the winter was well over, and I'm going to take him in hand today."
Toad's hour, of course,
cried the Mole delightedly.
Hooray! I remember now.
We'll teach him to be a sensible toad.
"Right you are,"
cried the Rat, starting up.
We'll rescue the poor unhappy animal. We'll convert him. He'll be the most converted toad that ever was before we've done with him."
They reached the carriage drive of Toad Hall to find a shiny new motor car of great size, painted a bright red, Toad's favourite colour, standing in front of the house. As they neared the door, it was flung open, and Mr. Toad, arrayed in goggles, cap, gaiters, and an enormous overcoat, came swaggering down the steps, drawing on his gauntleted gloves.
"Hello! Come on, you fellows!" he cried cheerfully on catching sight of them. "You're just in time to come with me for a jolly.
His hearty accents faltered and fell away as he noticed the stern, unbending look on the countenances of his silent friends, and his invitation remained unfinished. The Badger strode up the steps.
"Take him inside,"
he said sternly to his companions. Then, as Toad was hustled through the door, struggling and protesting, he turned to the chauffeur in charge of the new motor car.
"I'm afraid you won't be wanted today,"
he said.
"Mr. Toad has changed his mind. He will not require the car. Please understand that this is final. You needn't wait."
Then he followed the others inside, took Toad firmly by the arm, led him into the smoking room, and closed the door behind them.
"That's no good,"
said the Rat contemptuously.
"Talking to Toad'll never cure him. He'll say anything."
They made themselves comfortable in armchairs and waited patiently. Through the closed door they could just hear the long, continuous drone of the Badger's voice rising and falling in waves of oratory, and presently they noticed that the sermon began to be punctuated at intervals by long-drawn sobs, evidently proceeding from the bosom of Toad, who was a soft-hearted and affectionate fellow, very easily converted, for the time being, to any point of view. After some 3/4 of an hour, the door opened, and the Badger reappeared, solemnly leading by the paw a very limp and dejected Toad. His skin hung baggily about him, his legs wobbled, and his cheeks were furrowed by the tears so plentifully called forth by the Badger's moving discourse.
"Sit down there, Toad,"
said the Badger, kindly pointing to a chair.
"My friends," he went on, "I'm very pleased to inform you that Toad has at last seen the error of his ways. He's truly sorry for his misguided conduct in the past, and he has undertaken to give up motor cars entirely and forever. I have his solemn promise to that effect. There's only one thing more to be done," continued the gratified Badger. "Toad, I want you solemnly to repeat before your friends here what you fully admitted to me in the smoking room just now. First, you are sorry for what you've done, and you see the folly of it all."
There was a long, long pause. Toad looked desperately this way and that, while the other animals waited in grave silence. At last he spoke.
"No,"
he said, a little sullenly but stoutly.
"I'm not sorry, and it wasn't folly at all. It was simply glorious."
"What?"
cried the Badger, greatly scandalized.
"You backsliding animal! Didn't you tell me just now in there—"
"Oh, yes, in there," said Toad impatiently. "I'd have said anything in there. You're so eloquent, dear Badger, and so moving, and so convincing, and put all your points so frightfully well. You can do what you like with me in there, and you know it. But I've been searching my mind since and going over things in it, and I find that I'm not a bit sorry or repentant, really. And so it's no earthly good saying I am. Now, is it?"
"Very well, then,"
said the Badger firmly, rising to his feet.
"Since you won't yield to persuasion, we'll try what force can do. I feared it would come to this all along. You've often asked us three to come and stay with you, Toad, in this handsome house of yours. Well, now we're going to. When we've converted you to a proper point of view, we may quit, but not before. Take him upstairs, you two, and lock him up in his bedroom while we arrange matters between ourselves.
It's for your own good, Toady, you know,
said the rat kindly, as Toad, kicking and struggling, was hauled up the stairs by his two faithful friends. They descended the stair, Toad shouting abuse at them through the keyhole, and the three friends then met in conference on the situation.
It's going to be a tedious business, said the Badger, sighing. I've never seen Toad so determined. However, we will see it out. He must never be left for an instant unguarded. We shall have to take it in turns to be with him till the poison has worked itself out of his system. They arranged watches accordingly. Each animal took it in turns to sleep in Toad's room at night, and they divided the day up between them. At first, Toad was undoubtedly very trying to his careful guardians. As time passed, however, he grew apparently languid and depressed. One fine morning, the rat, whose turn it was to go on duty, went upstairs to relieve Badger, whom he found fidgeting to be off and stretch his legs in a long ramble round his wood and down his earths and burrows.
"How are you today, old chap?"
inquired the rat cheerfully as he approached Toad's bedside.
"Dear, kind rat,"
murmured Toad.
"how little you realize my condition. Oh, but do not trouble about me. I hate being a burden to my friends, and I do not expect to be one much longer. I'm a nuisance, I know."
"You are indeed. But I tell you, I'd take any trouble on earth for you, if only you'd be a sensible animal."
"If I thought that, Ratty,"
murmured Toad, more feebly than ever,
"then I would beg you, for the last time probably, to step round to the village as quickly as possible. Even now it may be too late, and fetch the doctor. Oh, but don't you bother. It's only a trouble, and perhaps we may as well let things take their course."
"Why, what do you want a doctor for?"
inquired the rat, coming closer and examining him. He certainly lay very still and flat, and his voice was weaker, and his manner much changed.
"And, by the way,"
Toad continued,
"while you are about it, I hate to give you additional trouble, but I happen to remember that you will pass the door. Do you mind at the same time asking the lawyer to step up? It would be a convenience to me, and there are moments, perhaps I should say there is a moment, when one must face disagreeable tasks at whatever cost to exhausted nature."
"A lawyer? Oh, he must really be bad,"
the affrighted rat said to himself as he hurried from the room, not forgetting, however, to lock the door carefully behind him. Outside he stopped to consider. The other two were far away, and he had no one to consult.
"It's best to be on the safe side,"
he said on reflection.
"I've known Toad fancy himself frightfully bad before without the slightest reason, but I've never heard him ask for a lawyer."
The Toad, who had hopped lightly out of bed as soon as he heard the key turn in the lock, watched him eagerly from the window till he disappeared down the carriage drive. Then, laughing heartily, he dressed as quickly as possible in the smartest suit he could lay hands on at the moment, filling his pockets with cash, which he took from a small drawer in the dressing-table, and next knotting the sheets from his bed together and tying one end of the improvised rope round the central mullion of the handsome Tudor window which formed such a feature of his bedroom. He scrambled out, slid lightly to the ground, and, taking the opposite direction to the rat, marched off light-heartedly, whistling a merry tune. It was a gloomy luncheon for Rat when the Badger and the Mole at length returned, and he had to face them at table with his pitiful and unconvincing story.
"He did it awfully well,"
said the crestfallen Rat.
"He did you awfully well,"
rejoined the Badger hotly.
However, talking won't mend matters. He's got clear away for the time, that's certain, and the worst of it is, he'll be so conceited with what he'll think is his cleverness that he may commit any folly. One comfort is we're free now and needn't waste any more of our precious time doing sentry go. But we'd better continue to sleep at Toad Hall for a while longer. Toad may be brought back at any moment on a stretcher or between two policemen.
So spoke the Badger, not knowing what the future held in store, or how much water, and of how turbid a character was to run under bridges before Toad should sit at ease once again in his ancestral hall. Meanwhile, Toad, gay and irresponsible, was walking briskly along the high road some miles from home. He strode along, his head in the air, till he reached a little town where the sign of the Red Lion, swinging across the road halfway down the main street, reminded him that he'd not breakfasted that day, and that he was exceedingly hungry after his long walk. He marched into the inn, ordered the best luncheon that could be provided at so short a notice, and sat down to eat it in the coffee-room. He was about halfway through his meal when an only too familiar sound approaching down the street made him start and fall a-trembling all over. The poop-poop drew nearer and nearer. The car could be heard to turn into the inn yard and come to a stop, and Toad had to hold on to the leg of the table to conceal his overmastering emotion. "There cannot be any harm," he said to himself, "in my only just looking at it." The car stood in the middle of the yard, quite unattended, the stable helps and other hangers-on being all at their dinner. Toad walked slowly around it, inspecting, criticizing, musing deeply. "I wonder," he said to himself presently, "I wonder if this sort of car starts easily." Next moment, hardly knowing how it came about, he found that he had hold of the handle and was turning it. As the familiar sound broke forth, the old passion seized on Toad and completely mastered him body and soul. As if in a dream, he found himself somehow seated in the driver's seat. As if in a dream, he pulled the lever and swung the car round the yard and out through the archway, and as if in a dream, all sense of right and wrong, all fear of obvious consequences seemed temporarily suspended. He increased his pace, and as the car devoured the street and leapt forth on the high road and through the open country, he was only conscious that he was Toad once more, Toad at his best and highest, Toad the terror, the traffic queller, the lord of the lone trail, before whom all must give way or be smitten into nothingness and everlasting night.
"To my mind," observed the chairman of the bench of magistrates cheerfully, "the only difficulty that presents itself in this otherwise very clear case is how we can possibly make it sufficiently hot for the incorrigible rogue and hardened ruffian whom we see cowering in the dock before us. Let me see. He has been found guilty on the clearest evidence, first of stealing a valuable motor car, secondly of driving to the public danger, and thirdly of gross impertinence to the rural police. Mr. Clerk, will you tell us, please, what is the very stiffest penalty we can impose for each of these offences?"
The clerk scratched his nose with his pen.
"Some people would consider,"
he observed,
"that stealing the motor car was the worst offence, and so it is. But cheeking the police undoubtedly carries the severest penalty, and so it ought. Supposing you would say 12 months for the theft, which is mild, and 3 years for the furious driving, which is lenient, and 15 years for the cheek, which was pretty bad sort of cheek. Those figures, if added together correctly, tot up to 19 years.
"First rate," said the chairman.
So you'd better make it around 20 years and be on the safe side,"
concluded the clerk.
"An excellent suggestion," said the chairman approvingly. "Prisoner, pull yourself together and try to stand up straight. It's going to be 20 years for you this time, and mind, if you appear before us again upon any charge whatever, we shall have to deal with you very seriously."
Then the brutal minions of the law fell upon the hapless Toad, loaded him with chains, and dragged him from the courthouse, shrieking, praying, protesting, across the marketplace, below the spiky portcullis, past sentries, up time-worn winding stairs, across courtyards, where mastiffs strained their leashes, on and on, past the rack-chamber and the thumbscrew room, past the turning that led to the private scaffold, till they reached the door of the grimmest dungeon that lay in the heart of the innermost keep. There at last they paused, where an ancient jailer sat fingering a bunch of mighty keys.
"Odds bodikins,"
said the sergeant of police, taking off his helmet and wiping his forehead.
"Rouse thee, old loon, and take over from us this vile Toad, a criminal of deepest guilt and matchless artfulness and resource. Watch and ward him with all thy skill."
The jailer nodded grimly, laying his withered hand on the shoulder of the miserable Toad. The rusty key creaked in the lock, the great door clanged behind them, and Toad was a helpless prisoner in the remotest dungeon of the best-guarded keep of the stoutest castle in all the length and breadth of merry England.
This is the end of everything. How can I hope to be ever set at large again, who have been imprisoned so justly for stealing so handsome a motor car in such an audacious manner? Oh, wise old badger! Oh, clever, intelligent rat and sensible mole! What sound judgments, what a knowledge of men and matters you possess! Oh, unhappy and forsaken Toad!
With lamentations such as these, he passed his days and nights for several weeks, refusing his meals or intermediate light refreshments, though the grim and ancient jailer, knowing that Toad's pockets were well lined, frequently pointed out that many comforts and indeed luxuries could, by arrangement, be sent in at a price from outside. Now, the jailer had a daughter, a pleasant wench and good-hearted one, who assisted her father in the lighter duties of his post. This kind-hearted girl, pitying the misery of Toad, said to her father one day,
"Father, I can't bear to see that poor beast so unhappy and getting so thin.
You let me have the managing of him." Her father replied that she could do what she liked with him, so that day she went on her errand of mercy and knocked at the door of Toad's cell.
"Now, cheer up, Toad," she said coaxingly on entering, "and sit up and dry your eyes, and be a sensible animal, and do try and eat a bit of dinner. See, I've brought you some of mine, hot from the oven." It was bubble and squeak between two plates, and its fragrance filled the narrow cell. The penetrating smell of cabbage reached the nose of Toad as he lay prostrate in his misery on the floor, and gave him the idea for a moment that perhaps life was not such a blank and desperate thing as he had imagined. But still he wailed and kicked with his legs and refused to be comforted. So the wise girl retired for the time. But of course a good deal of the smell of hot cabbage remained behind, as it will do. When the girl returned some hours later, she carried a tray with a cup of fragrant tea steaming on it, and a plate piled up with very hot buttered toast, cut thick, very brown on both sides, with the butter running through the holes in it like great golden drops, like honey from the honeycomb. The smell of that buttered toast simply talked to Toad, and with no uncertain voice. Toad sat up, dried his eyes, sipped his tea, and munched his toast, and soon began talking freely about himself and the house he lived in, his doings there, and how important he was, and what a lot his friends thought of him. The jailer's daughter saw that the topic was doing him as much good as the tea, as indeed it was, and encouraged him to go on. They had many interesting talks together after that as the dreary days went on, and the jailer's daughter grew very sorry for Toad and thought it a great shame that a poor little animal should be locked up in prison for what seemed to her a very trivial offence. One morning the girl was very thoughtful and answered at random, and did not seem to Toad to be paying proper attention to his witty sayings and sparkling comments. "Toad," she said presently, "just listen, please. I have an aunt who is a washerwoman."
There,
said Toad graciously and affably.
never mind. Think no more about it. I have several aunts who ought to be washerwomen.
"Now do be quiet a minute, Toad," said the girl. "You talk too much. That's your chief fault.
As I said, I have an aunt who is a washerwoman. She does the washing for all the prisoners in this castle. Now, I think if she were properly approached, squared, I believe is the word you animals use, you could come to some arrangement by which she would let you have her dress and bonnet and so on, and you could escape from the castle as the official washerwoman. You're very alike in many respects, particularly about the figure.
We're not, said the Toad in a huff. I have a very elegant figure for what I am.
So is my aunt, replied the girl, for what she is. But now that you're own way, you horrid, proud, ungrateful animal, when I'm sorry for you and trying to help you. Honest Toad was always ready to admit himself in the wrong.
You are a good, kind, clever girl, he said, and I am indeed a proud and stupid Toad. Introduce me to your worthy aunt, if you will be so kind, and I have no doubt that the excellent lady and I will be able to arrange terms satisfactory to both parties.
Next evening the girl ushered her aunt into Toad's cell, bearing his week's washing pinned up in a towel. The old lady had been prepared beforehand for the interview, and the sight of certain golden sovereigns that Toad had thoughtfully placed on the table in full view practically completed the matter and left little further to discuss. In return for his cash, Toad received a cotton print gown, an apron, a shawl, and a rusty black bonnet. "Now it's your turn, Toad," said the girl. "Take off that coat and waistcoat of yours. You're fat enough as it is." Shaking with laughter, she proceeded to hook and eye him into the cotton print gown, arranged the shawl with a professional fold, and tied the strings of the rusty bonnet under his chin. "You're the very image of her," she giggled. "Only I'm sure you'd never look half so respectable in your life before. Now, goodbye, Toad, and good luck." With a quaking heart, but as firm a footstep as he could command, Toad set forth cautiously on what seemed to be a most harebrained and hazardous undertaking. It seemed hours before he crossed the last courtyard, but at last he heard the wicket gate in the great outer door click behind him, felt the fresh air of the outer world upon his anxious brow, and knew that he was free. Dizzy with the easy success of his daring exploit, he walked quickly towards the lights of the town. As he walked along, considering, his attention was caught by some red and green lights a little way off to one side of the town, and the sound of puffing and snorting of engines and the banging of shunted trucks fell on his ear.
Aha! he thought. This is a piece of luck. A railway station is the thing I want most in the whole world at this moment.
He made his way to the station accordingly, and went off to the booking office to buy his ticket. He gave the name of the station that he knew to be nearest to the village, of which Toad Hall was the principal feature, and mechanically put his fingers, in search of the necessary money, where his waistcoat pockets should have been. Then, to his horror, he recollected that he had left both coat and waistcoat behind him in his cell, and with them his pocketbook, money, keys, watch, matches, pencil case, all that makes life worth living, all that distinguishes the many-pocketed animal, the lord of creation, from the inferior one-pocketed or no-pocketed productions that hop or trip about permissively, unequipped for the real contest. Baffled and full of despair, he wandered blindly down the platform where the train was standing. Soon he found himself opposite the engine, which was being oiled, wiped, and generally caressed by its affectionate driver, a burly man with an oil can in one hand and a lump of cotton waste in the other.
"Hello, Mother,"
said the engine driver.
"What's the trouble? You don't look particularly cheerful."
Oh, sir,
said Toad.
I'm a poor, unhappy washerwoman, and I've lost all my money and can't pay for a ticket, and I must get home tonight somehow, and whatever am I to do, I don't know. Oh, dear, oh, dear.
"That's a bad business indeed," said the driver, reflectively. "Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. You're a washerwoman to your trade, says you. Very well, that's that. And I'm an engine driver, as you may see, and there's no denying that it's terrible dirty work. Uses up a pair of shirts, it does, till my missus is fair tired of washing them. If you'll wash a few shirts for me when you get home and send them along, I'll give you a ride on my engine. It's against the company's regulations, but we're not so very particular in these out-of-the-way parts.
The toad's misery turned into rapture as he eagerly scrambled up into the cab of the engine. The guard waved his welcome flag, the engine driver whistled in cheerful response, and the train moved out of the station. They had covered many and many a mile, and Toad was already considering what he would have for supper as soon as he got home, when he noticed that the engine driver, with a puzzled expression on his face, was leaning over the side of the engine and listening hard. Then he saw him climb onto the coals and gaze out over the top of the train. Then returned, and he said to Toad, "That's very strange. We're the last train running in this direction tonight, yet I could be sworn that I heard another following us." Presently he called out, "I can see it clearly now. It is an engine on our rails, coming along at a great pace. It looks as if we're being pursued." The miserable Toad, crouching in the coal dust, tried hard to think of something to do, with dismal want of success. "They're gaining on us fast," cried the engine driver. "And the engine is crowded with the queerest lot of people. Men like ancient warders, waving halberds, policemen in their helmets, waving truncheons, and shabbily dressed men in pot hats, obvious and unmistakable plainclothes detectives, even at this distance, waving revolvers and walking sticks, all waving and all shouting the same thing, 'Stop, stop, stop!'" Then Toad fell on his knees among the coals, and raising his clasped paws in supplication, cried,
"Save me, only save me, dear kind Mr. Engine Driver, and I will confess everything. I am not the simple washerwoman I seem to be. I am a toad, the well-known and popular Mr. Toad, a landed proprietor. I have just escaped, by my great daring and cleverness, from a loathsome dungeon into which my enemies had flung me, and if those fellows on that engine recapture me, it'll be chains and bread and water and straw and misery once more for poor, unhappy, innocent Toad."
The engine driver looked down upon him very sternly and said, "Now tell the truth. What were you put in prison for?"
"Oh, it was nothing very much,"
said poor Toad, colouring deeply.
"I only borrowed a motor car while the owners were at lunch. They had no need of it at the time."
The engine driver looked very grave and said, "I fear that you have been indeed a wicked Toad, and by rights I ought to give you up to the offended justices. But you are evidently in sore trouble and distress, so I will not desert you. I don't hold with motor cars, for one thing, and I don't hold with being ordered about by policemen when I'm on my own engine for another. And the sight of an animal in tears always makes me feel queer and soft-hearted. So cheer up, Toad. I'll do me best, and we may beat 'em yet." They piled on more coals, shovelling furiously. The furnace roared, the sparks flew, the engine leapt and swung, but still their pursuers slowly gained. The engine driver, with a sigh, wiped his brow with a handful of cotton waste and said, "I'm afraid that's no good, Toad. You see, they're running light, and they have the better engine. There's just one thing left for us to do, and it's your only chance, so attend very carefully to what I tell you. A short way ahead of us is a long tunnel, and on the other side of that, the line passes through a thick wood. When we are through, I will shut off steam and put on brakes as hard as I can, and the moment it's safe to do so, you must jump and hide in the wood before they get through the tunnel and see you. Then I will go full speed ahead again, and they can chase me, if they like, for as long as they like, and for as far as they like. Now, mind and be ready to jump when I tell you." They piled on more coals, and the train shot into the tunnel, and the engine rushed and roared and rattled, till at last they shot out at the other end into fresh air and the peaceful moonlight, and saw the wood lying dark and helpful upon either side of the line. The driver shut off steam, put on brakes. The Toad got down on the step, and as the train slowed down to almost a walking pace, he heard the driver call out, "Now, jump!" Toad jumped, rolled down a short embankment, picked himself up unhurt, scrambled into the wood, and hid. Peeping out, he saw his train get up speed again and disappear at a great pace. Then out of the tunnel burst the pursuing engine, roaring and whistling, her motley crew waving their various weapons and shouting, "Stop! Stop! Stop!" When they were past, the Toad had a hearty laugh for the first time since he was thrown into prison. But he soon stopped laughing when he came to consider that it was now very late and dark and cold, and he was in an unknown wood with no money and no chance of supper, and still far from friends and home. After so many weeks within walls, he found the wood strange and unfriendly. An owl swooping noiselessly towards him brushed his shoulder with its wing, making him jump with a horrid certainty that it was a hand. Once he met a fox who stopped, looked him up and down in a sarcastic sort of way, and said, "Hello, washerwoman, half a pair of socks and a pillowcase short this week. Mind, it doesn't occur again," and swaggered off, sniggering. Toad looked about for a stone to throw at him, but he could not succeed in finding one, which vexed him more than anything. At last, cold, hungry, and tired out, he sought the shelter of a hollow tree, where, with branches and dead leaves, he made himself as comfortable a bed as he could, and slept soundly till the morning. The front door of the hollow tree faced eastwards, so Toad was called at an early hour. Sitting up, he rubbed his eyes first, and his complaining toes next, wondered for a moment where he was, looking round for familiar stone wall and little barred window, then with a leap of the heart remembered everything, his escape, his flight, his pursuit, remembered first, and best thing of all, that he was free. He had all the world to himself that early summer morning. As he tramped along gaily, he thought of his adventures and escapes, and how, when things seemed at their worst, he'd always managed to find a way out, and his pride and conceit began to swell within him. "Ho, ho," he said to himself as he marched along with his chin in the air. "What a clever Toad I am! There is surely no animal equal to me for cleverness in the whole world. My enemies shut me up in prison, encircled by sentries, watched night and day by warders. I walk through them all by sheer ability coupled with courage. They pursue me with engines and policemen and revolvers. I snap my fingers at them and vanish laughing into space. Oh, I am the Toad, the handsome, the popular, the successful Toad." He got so puffed up with his conceit that he made up a song as he walked in praise of himself, and sang it at the top of his voice, though there was no one to hear it but him. It was perhaps the most conceited song that any animal ever composed. "The world has had great heroes, as history books have showed, but never a name to go down to fame compared with that of Toad. The clever men at Oxford know all there is to be knowed, but they none of them know one half as much as intelligent Mr. Toad. The animals sat in the ark and cried, their tears in torrents flowed. Who was it said, 'There's land ahead,' encouraging Mr. Toad? The army all saluted as they marched along the road. Or was it the king or Kitchener? No, it was Mr. Toad. Oh, the Queen and her ladies in waiting sat at the window and sewed. She cried, 'Look, who's that handsome man?' They all answered, 'Mr. Toad.'" There was a great deal more of the same sort, but too dreadfully conceited to be written down. These are some of the milder verses. He sang as he walked, and he walked as he sang, and got more inflated every minute. But his pride was shortly to have a severe fall. After some miles of country lanes, he reached the high road, and as he turned into it and glanced along its white length, he saw approaching him a speck that turned into a dot, and then into a blob, and then into something very familiar. And a double note of warning, only too well known, fell on his delighted ear. He stepped confidently out into the road to hail the motor car, which came along at an easy pace, slowing down as it neared the lane, when suddenly he became very pale. His heart turned to water, his knees shook and yielded under him, and he doubled up and collapsed with a sickening pain in his interior. And well he might, the unhappy animal, for the approaching car was the very one he had stolen out of the yard of the Red Lion Hotel on that fatal day when all his troubles began, and the people in it were the very same people he had sat and watched at luncheon in the coffee-room. He sank down in a shabby, miserable heap in the road, murmuring to himself in his despair,
"Oh, it's all up. It's all over now. Chains and policemen again, prison again, dry bread and water again. Oh, hapless Toad. Oh, ill-fated animal."
The terrible motor car drew slowly nearer and nearer till at last he heard it stop just short of him. Two gentlemen got out and walked round the trembling heap of crumpled misery lying in the road, and one of them said,
"Oh dear, this is very sad. There's a poor old thing, a washerwoman, apparently, who's fainted in the road. Perhaps she's overcome by the heat, poor creature. Or probably she's not had any food today. Let's lift her into the car and take her to the nearest village where doubtless she has friends."
They tenderly lifted Toad into the motor car and propped him up with soft cushions and proceeded on their way. When Toad heard them talk in so kind and sympathetic a manner, he knew that he was not recognized. His courage began to revive, and he cautiously opened first one eye and then the other.
"Oh, look,"
said one of the gentlemen.
"she's better already. The fresh air's doing her good. How do you feel now, Mum?"
"Oh, thank you kindly, sir,"
said Toad in a feeble voice.
"I'm feeling a great deal better."
"That's right,"
said the gentleman.
"Now keep quite still, and above all,
Don't try to talk,
"I won't,"
said Toad.
"I was only thinking if I might sit on the front seat there beside the driver, where I could get the fresh air full in my face, I should soon be all right again."
what a very sensible woman,"
said the gentleman.
"Of course you shall."
So they carefully helped Toad into the front seat beside the driver, and on they went once more. Toad was almost himself again by now. He sat up, looked about him, and tried to beat down the tremors, the yearnings, the old cravings that rose up and beset him and took possession of him entirely.
"It is fate,"
he said to himself.
"Why strive? Why struggle?"
And he turned to the driver at his side.
"Please, sir,"
He said,
"I wish you would kindly let me try and drive the car for a little. I've been watching you very carefully, and it looks so easy and so interesting, and I should like to be able to tell my friends that once I had driven a motor car."
The driver laughed at the proposal so heartily that the gentleman inquired what the matter was.
When he heard, he said, to Toad's delight, "Bravo, ma'am, I like your spirit. Let her have a try. Look after her, she won't do any harm."
Toad eagerly scrambled into the seat vacated by the driver, took the steering wheel in his hands, listened with affected humility to the instructions given him, and set the car in motion, but very slowly and carefully at first, for he was determined to be prudent. The gentlemen behind him clapped their hands and applauded, and Toad heard them saying, "How well she does it! Fancy a washerwoman driving a car as well as that the first time!" Toad went a little faster, then faster still, and faster. He heard the gentleman call out warningly,
Be careful, washerwoman."
and this annoyed him, and he began to lose his head. The driver tried to interfere, but he pinned him down in his seat with one elbow and put on full speed.
"Washerwoman, indeed,"
He shouted recklessly.
"Ho, ho, ho! I am the Toad, the motor car snatcher, the prison breaker, the Toad who always escapes. Sit still, and you shall know what driving really is, for you are in the hands of the famous, the skillful, the entirely fearless Toad."
With a cry of horror, the whole party rose and flung themselves on him.
"Seize him!" they cried. "Seize the Toad, the wicked animal who stole our motor car. Bind him, chain him, drag him to the nearest police station. Down with the desperate and dangerous Toad!"
Alas, they should have thought. They ought to have been more prudent. They should have remembered to stop a motor car somehow before playing any pranks of that sort. With a half-turn of the wheel, the Toad sent the car crashing through the low hedge that ran along the roadside. One mighty bound, a violent shock, and the wheels of the car were churning up the thick mud of a horse-pond. Toad found himself flying through the air with the strong upward rush and delicate curve of a swallow. He liked the motion, and was just beginning to wonder whether it would go on until he developed wings and turned into a toad bird, when he landed on his back with a thump in the soft, rich grass of a meadow. Sitting up, he could just see the motor car in the pond, nearly submerged. The gentleman and the driver, encumbered by their long coats, were floundering helplessly in the water. He picked himself up rapidly and set off running across country as hard as he could, scrambling through hedges, jumping ditches, pounding across fields till he was breathless and weary and had to settle down into an easy walk. When he'd recovered his breath somewhat and was able to think calmly, he began to giggle. And from giggling, he took to laughing. And he laughed till he had to sit down under a hedge. He cried in ecstasies of self-admiration.
Toad again! Toad, as usual, comes out on top. Oh, how clever I am! How clever, how very clever!
A slight noise at a distance behind him made him turn his head and look. Oh, horror! Oh, misery! Oh, despair! About 2 fields off, a chauffeur in his leather gaiters and 2 large rural policemen were visible, running towards him as hard as they could go. Poor Toad sprang to his feet and pelted away again, his heart in his mouth. He glanced back and saw to his dismay that they were gaining on him. On he ran desperately, but kept looking back, and saw that they still gained steadily. He did his best, but he was a fat animal, and his legs were short, and still they gained. He could hear them close behind him now. Ceasing to heed where he was going, he struggled on blindly and wildly, looking back over his shoulder at the now triumphant enemy, when suddenly the earth failed under his feet. He grasped at the air, and splash! He found himself head over ears in deep water, rapid water, water that bore him along with a force he could not contend with, and he knew that in his blind panic he'd run straight into the river. He rose to the surface and tried to grasp the reeds and the rushes that grew along the water's edge close under the bank, but the stream was so strong that it tore them out of his hands. Presently he saw that he was approaching a big, dark hole in the bank, just above his head, and as the stream bore him past, he reached up with a paw and caught hold of the edge and held on. Then slowly and with difficulty he drew himself up out of the water, till at last he was able to rest his elbows on the edge of the hole. There he remained for some minutes, puffing and panting, for he was quite exhausted. As he sighed and blew and stared before him into the dark hole, some small, bright thing shone and twinkled in its depths, moving towards him. As it approached, a face grew up gradually all round it, and it was a familiar face, brown and small with whiskers, grave and round with neat ears and silky hair. It was the water rat. The rat put out a neat little brown paw, gripped Toad firmly by the scruff of the neck, and gave a great hoist and a pull, and the waterlogged Toad came up slowly but surely over the edge of the hole, till at last he stood safe and sound in the hall, streaked with mud and weed to be sure, and with the water streaming off him, but happy and high-spirited as of old.
Oh, Ratty! He cried. I've been through such times since I saw you last. You can't think. Such trials, such sufferings, and also nobly borne. Then such escapes, such disguises, such subterfuges, and all so cleverly planned and carried out.
Toad,
said the water rat gravely and firmly,
you go off upstairs at once and take off that old cotton rag that looks as if it might formerly have belonged to some washerwoman, and clean yourself thoroughly, and put on some of my clothes, and try and come down looking like a gentleman if you can. For a more shabby, bedraggled, disreputable-looking object than you, I've never set eyes on in my whole life. Now stop swaggering and arguing and be off. I'll have something to say to you later.
By the time he came down again, luncheon was on the table, and very glad Toad was to see it. While they ate, Toad told the rat all his adventures, dwelling chiefly on his own cleverness and presence of mind in emergencies and cunning in tight places, and rather making out that he'd been having a gay and highly coloured experience. But the more he talked and boasted, the more grave and silent the rat became. When at last Toad had talked himself to a standstill, there was silence for a while, and then the rat said,
Now, Toady, I don't want to give you pain after all you've been through already, but seriously, don't you see what an awful ass you've been making of yourself? On your own admission, you have been handcuffed, imprisoned, starved, chased, terrified out of your life, insulted and jeered at. Where does the fun come in? And all because you must needs go and steal a motor car.
The rat continued in this vein for some time, and when he'd finished, Toad heaved a humble sigh.
Quite right, Ratty. How sound you always are. Yes, I've been a conceited old ass. I can quite see that. But now I'm going to be a good toad and not do it any more. We'll have our coffee and a smoke and a quiet chat, and then I'm going to stroll gently down to Toad Hall and get into clothes of my own and set things going again on the old lines.
Stroll gently down to Toad Hall?
cried the rat, greatly excited.
What are you talking about? Do you mean to say you haven't heard?
Heard what?
Said Toad, turning rather pale.
Do you mean to tell me,
Shouted the rat, thumping with his little fist upon the table,
that you've heard nothing about the Stoats and the Weasels?
What? The Wild Wooders?
cried Toad, trembling in every limb.
No, not a word. What have they been doing?
And how they've been and taken Toad Hall?
Continued the rat. Toad leaned his elbows on the table and his chin on his paws, and a large tear welled up in each of his eyes, overflowed and splashed on the table, plop, plop.
Go on, Ratty, he murmured presently. Tell me all. The worst is over. I am an animal again. I can bear it.
When you got into that trouble of yours, said the rat slowly and impressively. I mean, when you disappeared from society for a time over that misunderstanding about a machine, you know.
Toad merely nodded.
Well, it was a good deal talked about down here, naturally. Not only along the riverside, but even in the wildwood, animals took sides, as always happens. The river bankers stuck up for you and said that you'd been infamously treated, and there was no justice to be had of the land nowadays. But the wildwood animals said hard things and served you right, and it was time this sort of thing was stopped. And they got very cocky and went about saying that you were done for this time. You would never come back again. Never, never.
Toad nodded once more, keeping silence.
That's the sort of little beasts they are.
The rat went on.
But Mole and Badger, they stuck out through thick and thin that you would come back again soon, somehow. They didn't know exactly how, but somehow. So they arranged to move their things into Toad Hall and sleep there and keep it aired and have it all ready for you when you turned up. They didn't guess what was going to happen, of course. Still, they had their suspicions of the wildwood animals. Now I come to the most painful and tragic part of my story. One dark night, a band of weasels, armed to the teeth, crept silently up the carriage drive to the front entrance. Simultaneously, a body of desperate ferrets, advancing through the kitchen garden, possessed themselves of the backyard and offices, while a company of skirmishing stoats, who stuck at nothing, occupied the conservatory and the billiard room, and held the French windows opening onto the lawn. The Mole and the Badger were sitting by the fire in the smoking room, telling stories and suspecting nothing, when those bloodthirsty villains broke down the doors and rushed in upon them from every side. They were unarmed and taken by surprise, and what can two animals do against hundreds? They took and beat them severely with sticks, those two poor faithful creatures, and turned them out into the cold and the wet with many insulting and uncalled-for remarks.
Here the unfeeling Toad broke into a snigger, and then pulled himself together and tried to look particularly solemn.
And the wildwooders have been living in Toad Hall ever since,
continued the rat.
and going on simply anyhow.
And the Mole and the Badger, said Toad lightly. What's become of them, the dear fellows?
Well, may you ask,
said the rat reproachfully.
While you were riding about the countryside in expensive motor cars, these two poor devoted animals have been camping out in the open in every sort of weather, living very rough by day and lying very hard by night, watching over your house, patrolling the boundaries, keeping a constant eye on the stoats and the weasels, scheming and planning and contriving how to get your property back for you. You don't deserve to have such true and loyal friends, Toad. You don't really.
I am an ungrateful beast, I know,
sobbed Toad, shedding bitter tears.
Let me go out and find them, out into the cold, dark night, and share their hardships, and try to prove by... hold on a bit. Surely I heard the chink of dishes on a tray. Supper's here at last. Hooray! Come on, Ratty.
They had just finished their meal and resumed their armchairs when there came a heavy knock at the door. Toad was nervous, but the rat, nodding mysteriously at him, went straight up to the door and opened it, and in walked Mr. Badger. He came solemnly up to Toad, shook him by the paw, and said,
Welcome home, Toad. Alas, what am I saying? Home, indeed. This is a poor homecoming. Unhappy Toad.
Then he turned his back on him, sat down to the table, drew his chair up, and helped himself to a large slice of cold pie. Presently there came another and a lighter knock. The rat went to the door and ushered in the mole, very shabby and unwashed, with bits of hay and straw sticking in his fur.
Hooray! Here's old Toad!
Cried the mole, his face beaming.
Fancy having you back again.
And he began to dance round him.
We never dreamed that you'd turn up so soon. Why, you must have managed to escape, you clever, ingenious, intelligent Toad.
The rat, alarmed, pulled him by the elbow, but it was too late. Toad was puffing and swelling already.
Clever? No, he said. I'm not really clever, according to my friends. I've only broken out of the strongest prison in England, that's all, and captured a railway train and escaped on it, that's all, and disguised myself and gone about the country humbugging everybody, that's all. Oh, no, I'm a stupid ass, I am. I'll tell you one or two of my little adventures, Mole, and you shall judge for yourself.
Toad, do be quiet, please,
said the rat.
And don't you egg him on, Mole, when you know what he is. But please tell us as soon as possible what the position is and what's best to be done now that Toad is back at last.
The position's about as bad as it can be, replied the mole grumpily. And as for what's to be done, why, blest if I know. The Badger and I have been round and round the place by night and by day, always the same thing. Sentries posted everywhere, guns poked out at us, stones thrown at us, always an animal on the lookout, and when they see us, my, how they do laugh. That's what annoys me most.
Then it's all over, sobbed the Toad. I shall go and enlist for a soldier and never see my dear Toad Hall any more.
Come, cheer up, Toady,
said the Badger.
There are more ways of getting back a place than taking it by storm. I haven't said my last word yet. Now I'm going to tell you a great secret.
Toad sat up slowly and dried his eyes.
There is an underground passage that leads from the river bank quite near here, right up into the middle of Toad Hall.
Oh, nonsense, Badger, said Toad rather airily. You've been listening to some of the yarns they spin in the public houses about here. I know every inch of Toad Hall inside and out. Nothing of the sort, I do assure you.
My young friend, said the Badger with great severity, your father, who was a worthy animal, a lot worthier than some others I know, was a particular friend of mine, and told me a great deal he wouldn't have dreamt of telling you. He discovered that passage. He didn't make it, of course. That was done hundreds of years before he ever came to live there. And he repaired it and cleaned it out because he thought it might come in useful some day in case of trouble or danger, and he showed it to me. Don't let my son know about it, he said. He's a good boy, but very light and volatile in character, and simply cannot hold his tongue. If he's ever in a real fix, and it would be of use to him, you may tell him about the secret passage, but not before.
The other animals looked hard at Toad to see how he would take it. Toad was inclined to be sulky at first, but he brightened up immediately, like the good fellow he was.
I've found out a thing or two lately, continued the Badger. I got Otter to disguise himself as a sweep and call at the back door with brushes over his shoulder, asking for a job. There's going to be a big banquet tomorrow night. It's somebody's birthday, the Chief Weasel's, I believe, and all the weasels will be gathered together in the dining hall, eating and drinking and laughing and carrying on, suspecting nothing. No guns, no swords, no sticks, no arms of any sort whatever.
But the sentinels will be posted as usual,
remarked the rat.
Exactly, said the badger. That is my point. The weasels will trust entirely to their excellent sentinels, and that is where the passage comes in. That very useful tunnel leads right up under the butler's pantry next to the dining hall.
Aha! That squeaky board in the butler's pantry,
said Toad.
Now I understand it.
We shall creep out quietly into the butler's pantry,
cried the mole.
with our pistols and swords and sticks,
shouted the rat.
And rush in upon them,
said the badger.
And whack 'em, and whack 'em, and whack 'em,
cried the toad in ecstasy, running round and round the room and jumping over the chairs.
Very well, then,
said the badger, resuming his usual dry manner.
Our plan is settled, and there's nothing more for you to argue and squabble about. So, as it's getting very late, all of you go right off to bed at once. We will make all the necessary arrangements in the course of the morning tomorrow.
Toad slept till a late hour next morning, and by the time he got down, he found that the other animals had finished their breakfast some time before. The mole had slipped off somewhere by himself without telling anyone where he was going. The badger sat in the armchair, reading the paper and not concerning himself in the slightest about what was going to happen that very evening. The rat, on the other hand, was running round the room busily, with his arms full of weapons of every kind, distributing them in 4 little heaps on the floor, and saying excitedly under his breath as he ran,
"Here's a sword for the rat, here's a sword for the mole, here's a sword for the toad, here's a sword for the badger, here's a pistol for the rat, here's a pistol for the mole, here's a pistol for the toad, here's a pistol for the badger,"
and so on in a regular, rhythmical way, while 4 little heaps gradually grew and grew. Luncheon was a simple but sustaining meal, bacon and broad beans and a macaroni pudding, and when they had quite done, the badger settled himself into an armchair and said,
Well, we've got our work cut out for us tonight, and it'll probably be pretty late before we're quite through with it, so I'm just going to take 40 winks while I can.
And he drew a handkerchief over his face and was soon snoring. When it began to grow dark, the rat, with an air of excitement and mystery, summoned them back into the parlour, stood each of them alongside of his little heap, and proceeded to dress them up for the coming expedition. When all was quite ready, the badger took a dark lantern in one paw, grasped his great stick with the other, and said,
Now then, follow me.
So at last they were all in the secret passage, and the cutting-out expedition had really begun. It was cold and dark and damp and low and narrow. They groped and shuffled along with their ears pricked up and their paws on their pistols, till at last the badger said,
We ought by now to be pretty nearly under the hall.
Then suddenly they heard, far away as it might be, yet apparently nearly over their heads, a confused murmur of sound. Hooray, 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 hooray! They heard, and the stamping of little feet on the floor, and the clinking of glasses as little fists pounded on the table.
What a time they're having,
said the badger.
Come on.
They hurried along the passage till it came to a full stop, and they found themselves standing under the trap door that led up into the butler's pantry. The badger said,
Now, boys, all together.
And the 4 of them put their shoulders to the trap door and heaved it back. The noise as they emerged from the passage was simply deafening. At last, as the cheering and hammering slowly subsided, a voice could be made out saying,
Well, I do not propose to detain you much longer, but before I resume my seat, I should like to say one word about our kind host, Mr. Toad. We all know Toad, good Toad, modest Toad, honest Toad.
Shrieks of merriment followed this last remark.
Oh,
Only just let me get at him, muttered Toad, grinding his teeth.
Hold hard a minute,
Said the Badger, restraining him with difficulty.
get ready, all of you.
Let me sing you a little song,
went on the voice.
which I have composed on the subject of a toad.
Then the Chief Weasel, for it was he, began in a high, squeaky voice.
Toad he went a-pleasuring gaily down the street.
The Badger drew himself up, took a firm grip of his stick with both paws, glanced around at his comrades, and cried,
The hour is come, follow me!
and flung the door open wide. My, what a squealing and a squeaking and a screeching filled the air! Well might the terrified weasels dive under the tables and spring madly up at the windows. Well might the ferrets rush wildly for the fireplace and get hopelessly jammed in the chimney. Well might tables and chairs be upset, and glass and china be sent crashing on the floor in the panic of that terrible moment when the four heroes strode wrathfully into the room. The mighty Badger, his whiskers bristling, his great cudgel whistling through the air, Mole, black and grim, brandishing his stick and shouting his awful war cry, "A mole! A mole!" Rat, desperate and determined, his belt bulging with weapons of every age and each variety. Toad, frenzied with great excitement and injured pride, swollen to twice his ordinary size, leaping into the air and emitting toad whoops that chilled them to the marrow. "Toad, he went a-pleasuring," he yelled. "I'll pleasure 'em!" And he went straight for the Chief Weasel. They were but four in all, but to the panic-stricken weasels the hall seemed full of monstrous animals, grey, black, brown, and yellow, whooping and flourishing enormous cudgels, and they broke and fled with squeals of terror and dismay, this way and that, through the windows, up the chimney, anywhere to get out of the reach of those terrible sticks. The affair was soon over. Up and down the whole length of the hall strode the four friends, whacking with their sticks at every head that showed itself, and in 5 minutes the room was cleared. Through the broken windows the shrieks of terrified weasels escaping across the lawn were borne faintly to their ears. On the floor lay prostrate some dozen or so of the enemy, on whom the Mole was busily engaged in fitting handcuffs. The Badger, resting from his labours, leant on his stick and wiped his honest brow.
I want some grub, I do,
he said in that rather common way he had of speaking.
Stir your stumps, Toad, and look lively. We've got your house back for you, and you don't offer us so much as a sandwich.
Toad bustled about, and so did the Rat, and soon they found some guava jelly in a glass dish, and a cold chicken, a tongue that had hardly been touched, some trifle, and quite a lot of lobster salad. And in the pantry they came upon a basket full of French rolls, and any quantity of cheese, butter, and celery. So they finished their supper in great joy and contentment, and presently retired to rest between clean sheets, safe in Toad's ancestral home, won back by matchless valour, consummate strategy, and a proper handling of sticks. The following morning, Toad, who had overslept himself as usual, came down to breakfast disgracefully late. The Badger looked up as the latecomer entered and remarked rather shortly,
I'm sorry, Toad, but I'm afraid there's a heavy morning's work in front of you. You see, we really ought to have a banquet at once to celebrate this affair. It's expected of you. In fact, it's the rule.
"Oh, all right," said the Toad readily. "Anything to oblige. What is my pleasure or convenience compared with that of others? You wish it done, and it shall be done." The Badger looked at him very suspiciously, but Toad's frank, open countenance made it difficult to suggest any unworthy motive in this change of attitude. He quitted the room, and as soon as the door had closed behind him, Toad hurried to the writing table. A fine idea had occurred to him while he was talking. He would write the invitations, and he would take care to mention the leading part he'd taken in the fight, and how he had laid the Chief Weasel flat, and he would hint at his adventures, and what a career of triumph he had to tell them about. And on the fly-leaf he would give a sort of programme of entertainment for the evening, something like this, as he sketched it out in his head.
Speech by Toad. There will be other speeches by Toad during the evening. Address by Toad. Song by Toad, composed by himself. Other compositions by Toad, and will be sung in the course of the evening by the composer."
The idea pleased him mightily, and he worked very hard and got all the letters finished by noon. When the other animals came back to luncheon, very boisterous and breezy after a morning on the river, the mole looked doubtfully at Toad, expecting to find him sulky or depressed. Instead, he was so uppish and inflated that the mole began to suspect something, while the rat and the badger exchanged significant glances. As soon as the meal was over, Toad thrust his paws deep into his trouser pockets, remarked casually,
"Well, look after yourselves, you fellows. Ask for anything you want."
and was swaggering off in the direction of the garden where he wanted to think out an idea or two for his coming speeches, when the rat caught him by the arm. Toad rather suspected what he was after, and did his best to get away, but when the badger took him firmly by the other arm, he began to see that the game was up. The two animals conducted him between them back into the smoking room that opened out of the entrance hall, shut the door, and put him in a chair. Then they both stood in front of him, while Toad sat silent and regarded them with much suspicion and ill humour.
"Now, look here, Toad,"
said the rat.
"It's about this banquet, and very sorry I am to have to speak to you like this, but we want you to understand clearly, once for all, that there are going to be no speeches and no songs. Try and grasp the fact that on this occasion we are not arguing with you, we're just telling you."
Toad saw that he was trapped.
"Mayn't I sing just one little song?"
He pleaded piteously.
"No, not one little song,"
replied the rat firmly, though his heart bled as he noticed the trembling lip of the poor disappointed Toad.
"It's no good, Toady. You know well that your songs are all conceit and boasting and vanity, and your speeches are all self-praise and, gross exaggeration and...
And gas,"
put in the badger in his common way.
"It's for your own good, Toady,"
went on the rat.
"You know you must turn over a new leaf sooner or later, and now seems a splendid time to begin, a sort of turning point in your career. Please don't think that saying all this doesn't hurt me more than it hurts you."
Toad remained a long while plunged in thought. At last he raised his head, and the traces of strong emotion were visible on his features.
"You have conquered, my friends,"
he said in broken accents, and pressing his handkerchief to his face, he left the room with faltering footsteps.
"Badger,"
said the rat,
"I feel like a brute. I wonder what you feel like."
"Oh, I know,"
said the badger gloomily.
"but the thing had to be done. This good fellow has got to live here and hold his own and be respected. Would you have him a common laughing-stock, mocked and jeered at by stoats and weasels?"
"Of course not,"
said the rat.
"And talking of weasels, it's lucky we came upon that little weasel just as he was setting out with Toad's invitations. I suspected something from what you told me, and had a look at one or two. They were simply disgraceful. I confiscated the lot, and the good mole is now sitting in the blue boudoir, filling up plain, simple invitation cards."
At last the hour for the banquet began to draw near, and Toad, who on leaving the others had retired to his bedroom, was still sitting there, melancholy and thoughtful. His brow resting on his paw, he pondered long and deeply. Gradually his countenance cleared, and he began to smile, long, slow smiles. Then he took to giggling in a shy, self-conscious manner. At last he got up, locked the door, drew the curtains across the windows, collected all the chairs in the room and arranged them in a semicircle, and took up his position in front of them, swelling visibly. Then he bowed, coughed twice, and, letting himself go, with uplifted voice he sang to the enraptured audience that his imagination so clearly saw.
"Toad's last little song. The toad came home. There was panic in the parlour and howling in the hall. There was crying in the cowshed and a shrieking in the stall. When the toad came home, when the toad came home, there was smashing in of window and a crashing in of door. There was chivying of weasels that fainted on the floor. When the toad came home, bang go the drums. The trumpeters are tooting and the soldiers are saluting and the cannon they are shooting and the motor cars are hooting as the hero comes. Shout hooray, and let each one of the crowd try and shout it very loud in honor of an animal of whom you're justly proud, for it's Toad's great day.
He sang this very loud, with great unction and expression, and when he had done, he sang it all over again. Then he heaved a deep sigh, a long, long, long sigh. Then he dipped his hairbrush in the water jug, parted his hair in the middle, and plastered it down very straight and sleek on each side of his face, and, unlocking the door, went quietly down the stairs to greet his guests, whom he knew must be assembling in the drawing-room. All the animals cheered when he entered, and crowded round to congratulate him and say nice things about his courage and his cleverness and his fighting qualities, but Toad only smiled faintly and murmured, "Ah, not at all," or sometimes, for a change, "On the contrary." The Badger had ordered everything of the best, and the banquet was a great success. Some of the younger and livelier animals, as the evening wore on, got whispering to each other that things were not so amusing as they used to be in the good old days, and there were some knockings on the table and cries of, "Toad, speech, speech, speech from Toad, song, Mr. Toad's song." But Toad only shook his head gently, raised one paw in mild protest, and by pressing delicacies on his desk, by topical small talk, and by earnest inquiries after members of their families not yet old enough to appear at social functions, managed to convey to them that this dinner was being run on strictly conventional lines. He was indeed an altered Toad. After this climax, the four animals continued to lead their lives, so rudely broken in upon by civil war, in great joy and contentment, undisturbed by further risings or invasions. Sometimes, in the course of long summer evenings, the friends would take a stroll together in the wild wood, now successfully tamed as far as they were concerned, and it was pleasing to see how respectfully they were greeted by the inhabitants, and how the mother weasels would bring their young ones to the mouths of their holes and say, pointing, "Look, baby, there goes the great Mr. Toad, and that's the gallant water rat, a terrible fighter, walking along of him, and yonder comes the famous Mr. Mole, of whom you so often have heard your father tell." But when their infants were fractious and quite beyond control, they would quiet them by telling how, if they didn't hush them and not fret them, the terrible grey Badger would up and get them. This was a base libel on Badger, who, though he cared little about society, was rather fond of children. But it never failed to have its full effect.